Half-Life Alyx is a weird game. It's a VR spin-off that no one really asked for or even expected. It's had practically no marketing or advertising, and it's been released at the same time as arguably one of the biggest first-person shooters of all time with Doom Eternal. It's kind of funny too when you realise that Half-Life 2 also came out around the same time as Doom 3. And yet, this might be one of the most important games in the series now because of the direction it takes the story. If you're one of the 12 people who own a VR headset and one of the 3 or 4 who own a Valve Index, well, this is pretty much a must-play. Right, before I get too far, I do have to stop here and give a shout out to ExpressVPN for sponsoring this video. ExpressVPN offers premium servers, 24/7 customer support, all for an affordable $7 a month. If you don't know what a VPN is, it's short for a virtual private network, and it basically just gives you the privacy of using the internet without people being able to get access to your personal information, like your old DeviantArt account. The other thing is that it allows you to switch countries, getting around geo restriction blocks, which is kinda handy if you want to watch things on Netflix or YouTube that aren't otherwise available in your region. I've been set up with ExpressVPN, and using it is as easy as clicking an executable and then you're good to go. And if that's not enough, it's also been highly rated by sites like TechRadar and CNET. And I've loved using it simply because people can't see me playing my visual novels or dating sims anymore. I can't think of a reason to not use a VPN at all times, so there's a link in the video description to set you up with the first 3 months for free. expressvpn.com/gman. Anyway, back to the video. Now, my experience with VR games isn't huge. You can count the amount of them I've played on 2 hands, but I do have experience with Half-Life, having been a huge fan of the series for almost 2 decades now. And whether or not you end up playing this thing, I can guarantee you're gonna hear people talking about it. So the whole thing takes place in City 17, 5 years before the events in Half-Life 2, when Alyx is only 19, just a small town girl living in a lonely world. She's taken the midnight train going anywhere. There's no Barney, Dr. Breen, or Dr. Kleiner, just your old man Alyx Vance, and another scientist named Russell, who's in the game because someone at Valve watched Thor Ragnarok.
Oh, wait, I almost forgot.
Alyx, up here! You're gonna need a gun! Don't worry, it's unloaded. It's unloaded now!
Russell is voiced by a dude named Rhys Darby, who's a genuinely funny New Zealand actor from a show called Flight of the Conchords. And he's the creator of the gravity gloves you use throughout the game, aptly named the Russells, as well as being the source of comical relief.
Oh, do you need a minute? Cause, I could pause the feed.
Just looking, Russ.
The early goal of the game is just to find and rescue your dad, who's been kidnapped by Civil Protection and taken to Nova Prospekt, but as you'd expect for a Half-Life game, things soon get out of hand. Also, the irony of the campaign, sending you into a quarantine zone during all of this, was not lost on me either. There are eventually some pretty direct ties to what happens in Half-Life 2, what could almost be described as retconning in some instances, and I gotta say that these are just incredible to watch. If you just want to play this thing to get some kind of advancement to the whole saga, well, you're gonna get it. It's just gonna take 10 or so hours to get there. There's a post-credit scene that is so awesome that it made me shout out loud like an idiot. Honestly, it almost makes up for the other dramas I had with this thing. I won't spoil it, but I'll just say that the right woman in the wrong place can make all the difference.
Sounds good.
In terms of the performance, it's okay. Most of the time I had a pretty steady frame rate, but then there were times that the game just started chugging along for no real reason. And it oddly happened at times when there wasn't even really all that much stuff happening on the screen. I was playing it with an Oculus Rift S, and I never had any serious issues with the sensors or controls. Most of the time, it did what I wanted it to do and with little fuss. It's a good thing too, because this has to be hands down one of the best looking VR games I think I've ever played, and it's really cool seeing things like the Citadel for the first time. Along with all those familiar enemies close up, like head crabs, zombies, and even Combine advisors at one point. It's kind of a shame that recording VR games has that weird effect in the replay where it looks like you're always facing the ground. So the footage doesn't really do the whole thing justice. Let me just say though, it is a remarkable looking game and one of the most detailed environments I've ever seen in a VR title. But the loading times, my god, son, the loading times. Honestly, when you first load the game up, it takes me upwards of like 2 minutes sometimes to load a level, and when you reload a save file, it's also a really long wait. Here's a list of the things I've done while this game loads a level. I've gone and gotten a glass of water. I've made some tea. I've drank some tea. I've gone and gotten something to eat out of my fridge, I've made some coffee, drank some coffee, and I've had a piss. Most of the levels are large enough that this isn't that much of an issue, but look, just get comfortable for a bit when you see those loading screens, man. Just, I don't know, sit down or something. Now, when it comes to the gameplay side of things, I'd say it's pretty damn polished, but honestly, it doesn't really do anything all that new or groundbreaking. Yeah, I mean, it makes good use of the controllers and the way you interact with objects is clever, but it's not really anything that we haven't ever seen before. Early on in the game, you'll hold your hands up as you're held at gunpoint by the Combine. Later in the game, you'll cover your mouth to prevent yourself from coughing from toxic gas. Being able to cook a grenade, then lean over some railings and drop it down into some unsuspecting zombies is pretty cool.
Ciao.
You put a spare magazine into a gun, then you pull back the slide to load it, grab a healing syringe and jab yourself in the gut to get health back. You grab handles and levers, open cupboards and doors like you would in real life. Or you can pick up a marker and write down important messages for other Resistance members to decipher. Where it differs though is how they've tried to incorporate their own version of Half-Life 2's gravity gun with these special gloves that Alyx is able to use now. Now these are pretty cool. With these you can lock onto any physics item and pull it towards you, which is handy for grabbing weapon magazines and other items without having to physically walk over to pick them up. And once you get the hang of it, it becomes pretty seamless. You can even get really tricky and pull like a grenade off a Combine soldier's belt. Weapons are limited to Alyx's pistol, which you'll eventually upgrade to the one she's seen using in Half-Life 2. Then you've got a makeshift shotgun and a Combine SMG. That thing's kinda like a weaker, single-handed version of Half-Life 2's pulse rifle. The excuse for not being able to use other Combine guns is that apparently they're coded to DNA, kind of like the Lawgivers in Judge Dredd. Man, can you imagine a Judge Dredd VR game? That'd be dope. Anyway, you can then upgrade these guns through Combine machines you find throughout the levels with resin you find in single units scattered around the game world. Put a laser on the pistol to make aiming easier, or a grenade launcher on the shotgun. It actually makes you want to seek out and find all of this resin and not just blast your way through the whole thing like a coked up speedrunner. Finally, you've got Alyx's little multi-tool, again an item we've seen her use in Half-Life 2, and this thing is used to hack into storage lockers and get through locked doors. Through these little hacking minigames that become incredibly tedious the more you do them. They're about as much fun as dragging your nutsack across sandpaper. The one you have to do the most is to track wires through solid walls, linking them up with power boxes. Then the other one, to get into the storage cabinet, you've got to rotate this giant holographic ball and connect these nodes a couple of times. And you know what? I'd rather pluck the hairs from my arse cheeks with the teeth of a rabid dog than do these. They're just so unfun. And yet you kind of have to do them because they're always keeping you from much needed ammo and health items. When it all comes together though, it's a mostly engaging gameplay loop. The controls work pretty well and muscle memory sets in quick. You'll be shooting enemies, reloading and hacking into things with little drama. There's a couple of new enemies, like an armoured headcrab that can only be killed by a giant glowing weak spot on its belly. But the gameplay quickly settles into a very safe rhythm very early on that it does never really kind of move past. You shoot something, then spend a bit of time solving puzzles and collecting resources before then shooting something else. In fact, I'd say it's probably like a 70-30 ratio of puzzles to combat, where in my opinion it should be the other way around. The thing that makes it all so appealing and interesting though is that it takes place in the Half-Life universe and it relies a lot on its license and existing lore, not to mention the whole thing's in VR. Being able to perceive depth and space is way more interactive and engaging than seeing something on a flat screen, and that's the exact same thing here. Walking through City 17 and seeing civil protection units that look like you can reach out and touch them. Admiring the gore and the detail on a headcrab zombie, or just the sight of a headcrab scuttling about and jumping around. Moving through a dilapidated hotel and seeing the ceilings covered in barnacles that happen to feed on nearby creatures, like the whole thing is pretty awesome. It's why people who play VR games lap this shit up so much, and something that people who don't play VR games just don't understand. I mean, not to sound condescending. Early on in the game you meet a Vortigaunt who's suffered a head injury, which means he's now unable to psychically communicate with all the other Vortigaunts. And you can see the desperation in this dude's eyes as he asks you for help to find his friends. There's just something about seeing this unfold right in front of you that makes it so much more compelling. Now that's not to say that the whole thing relies on the gimmick of VR to get by. Valve has always been really good at making the player learn things about the gameplay without them even realizing.
Yes.
Nice throw.
A good example of this is a point in the game when you come across an abandoned vodka factory. As you enter, there's a bunch of bottles all over the place, so you do what anyone would do in a VR game with physics. You start throwing the bottles around and smashing them. Then you learn about 10 minutes later that you're now spending the whole level avoiding a blind monster that reacts only to noise. And the best way to distract this thing, you guessed it, throwing bottles. It's like before you even knew you had to learn how to throw bottles, the game somehow tricked you into doing it by default. One of the things I didn't even expect this game to do was make me sympathise with the headcrab zombies. You often forget that a lot of these are innocent people that just got unlucky enough to have one of those things latch onto their head. And if you remember the moans and screams the zombies had in Half-Life 2, well, multiply that by 100. You will genuinely feel sorry for these things. At one point during a level set in a zoo, I saw a zombie in a worker's outfit staring at a wall of children's drawings and whimpering to itself. And you know that it was just clinging on to some kind of memory that it still had from being human. It's been confirmed that during the early stages of this infection that some people are still completely conscious, making their whole predicament even more fucked up.
Nice shooting, Alyx.
Thanks.
A new enemy type is this electrical dog thing that runs around and can even possess dead bodies like a goddamn necromorph, shooting out lightning bolts. And when this thing is near death after you've shot it enough, you'll see it crawling across the ground, whimpering. And there's just so many details like this in the way this world is constructed that it makes it far more compelling than your average VR experience. It's even got the length to prove it, coming in at about 10 hours all up. Now look, I can appreciate that this is such a long game, but did it really need to be this long?
Not necessarily.
I mean, the first 5 or so hours of the whole campaign, you'll just mostly be going around and shooting head crabs and head crab zombies, solving the occasional puzzle here and there to mix things up a bit. The few times you get to fight Combine soldiers early on are exciting, but they're short and fleeting. And then you're back to slowly moving through some kind of dingy shithole, avoiding a bunch of head crabs who casually walk into your field of view. Even at most, you'll only ever fight like half a dozen people at once. Later in the game, you'll get a few combat sequences up against antlions, but they're just all over so quickly. The other disappointing thing is that the Combine soldiers aren't really all that mobile or even intelligent. I mean, they never really were to begin with though. Seemed in Half-Life 2 their strategy consisted of either running towards you and shooting, or running away and shooting. This time around, they often just stand still for seconds at a time, begging to be put out of their misery. Sometimes they might move back and forth into cover, but it's hardly groundbreaking stuff. I'd even go so far as to call these guys dumb. Like, you'll throw a grenade at their feet and they'll just casually stare at it as it blows up. Instead of being imposing and threatening, 19-year-old Alyx Vance takes these bulky armoured guys out like it's nothing.
Oh.
You've got the option for locomotion controls and teleporting, but you kind of have to use a combination of both by design. Teleporting is needed for jumping short distances, and while you can also use it for basic movement, during combat you'd probably get thumped if you were just standing still. Not to mention, you pretty much have to be standing to play this too, like you'll need to physically move your body in and out of cover during combat sometimes, and some of the puzzle solving pretty much demands movement for your entire body.
You should have plenty of time to get the override back online.
This game could have crammed all this stuff into 5 hours and still been fun to play. The 10-hour mark seems more like bragging rights, or like it's some kind of pissing contest for Valve to show everyone else how much longer and better their campaign is. The other big issue is that the whole thing's VR only, and I think the amount of people that have a VR headset is still incredibly low, according to Steam stats anyway. It'd be like a new Halo or Grand Theft Auto game coming out in VR too, it's just such an odd choice. The problem is that the whole thing probably wouldn't work the same in a non-VR mode, and seeing as Valve have habitually shown they don't really give a shit what their fanbase thinks or wants, it's unlikely we'll ever see any kind of non-VR support. What's most important though is that this does feel like an official Half-Life game, and it doesn't feel gimmicky or like it relies too much on the crutch of VR to carry things along. I do wish that it tried some new things and was a bit more ambitious, and I think it could have benefited greatly from some more combat sequences. But this is still one of the most polished VR games you're ever going to experience, and the added benefit of it filling in some of the blanks for Half-Life's timeline is just icing on the proverbial cake. The ending for this thing left me with goosebumps and chills. It was almost uncharacteristic for Valve software in the way that it gave so much stuff away, and that post-credits sequence left a bulge in my trousers.
I know. This is bad.
So if you've got the gear to get it all up and running, it's an easy recommendation from me. Forget about Freeman.